I'd like also to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, upon whose lands this beautiful campus now stands, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and particularly thank Auntie Rhonda for her beautiful opening comments. Auntie Rhonda has done a master's about storytelling, cultural storytelling with us at UTS, and is also working on her PhD with some of my dearest colleagues. So thank you very much, Auntie. For those attending online, let's all acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands and spaces on which they are working and listening today, and pay respects to their elders past and present. So it's December 1988 and I arrive at ANU. I'm 22 years old. I know nobody in the town. I have a job as the research assistant in the art history department, and in fact I was the slide curator. This was a very important role before digital resources. When the professor came to me one day and showed me the first digital image and also showed us how to send an email, my reply was, this will never catch on. So things change. Now, there was a lovely old man that used to come and sit in the office next to me. In those days, ANU kept an office for the professors once they retired to collect their mail and sit and read their mail and maybe have an occasional conversation. But my neighbour was A.D. Hope. This is what A.D. Hope wrote at his annual lecture in 1970 for the Academy. The literary influence of an academy can only be effective if its members are prepared to be daring, controversial, enterprising, imaginative, and to take up large and important issues, to pronounce on them clearly and firmly, and to advance the light by showing themselves. What a beautiful statement. I really like this idea of showing yourself. You've all come today. It's very important that we show ourselves and turn up for the humanities. So thank you so much for coming and participating. I'm sure we would all agree that audiences for creative practice formats, whether it's design, architecture, art, music, film, fashion, animation, gaming, performance, brand strategy, have never been greater. Our cities, our precincts, our museums, our business, and our cultural spaces now embrace new approaches to storytelling, subjectivity, diversity, and difference. As a result, we gain new insights, interpretations, approaches, techniques, and formats. As we have this creative tension of the humanities interacting with creative practices, which, to be frank, in the past were often taught quite separately. I used to get in trouble for hanging out with the people of the art school, for example, at times when I was in my art history department, which I could never understand as a young person. I've done a bit of research about creative people in suburbs like inner city Sydney, Darlinghurst and Paddington, and what I found was that creative people are the ones who propel society in new directions. This could be literature, screenwriting, art, music, sound, design, performance, theatre, film, digital media, all these practices. But also, I think everyday practices are very important. The crafts, often conducted by women and working class people in the past, have come full circle and now inspire new cultural modes. Over the conference, we have a very nice we have thematics, and we also have cross-sections about particular times and periods. You'll hear everything about Chekhov plays, I think, to digital media and Indigenous fashion. So in the past, creative people in our cultural space were often associated with bohemianism, the idea of the outsider viewer, which has, of course, shifted meaning and emphasis over time and also been very critiqued because it was often a very male concern. 19th century Australian creativity ranged across a very big variety of artisanal and technological feats, which often involved the do-it-yourself culture of semi- and skilled workers who were not intellectuals. By the 1890s, it might have been bohemian in Sydney to be a writer, a poet, a musician or artist. By the 1960s, the creatives are debating formalism, feminism, and resisting the Vietnam War. We have Paul Keating's Creative Nation strategy, 1994, which broadened understandings of culture beyond what were perceived as elite or classical modes, and promoted instead the concept of cultural workers, which is sort of the milieu that I was trained in the 1980s. So there's a huge popularity of design, animation, fashion, film, design thinking, cultural leadership, transdisciplinary and creative courses amongst our university students today. This shows that the word creative is not just a buzzword. As the chief executive of CSIRO stated in August 2017, you don't just change the world by thinking the same as everyone else. Diversity of perspective is the compass to navigate the ambiguity of innovation. But creativity has to be nurtured and developed, I think, often within disciplinary thinking, but often then it will break those bounds, becoming intra, or transdisciplinary, generating improbable but exciting connections in the humanities and across the creative arts. The art historians in the room will know that a lot of creative practice in the past was introspective or solitary, the idea of the sole artist in the garret, although in fact that was a myth in most cases. More often today, it will be communal, participatory and relational. And inner city spaces such as we're working on today at Tech Central that surround UTS often facilitate this creative labour and ingenuity of a wide range of plethora of peoples. As our symposium will argue today, working on country and from Indigenous and decolonial perspectives can break these spatial and conceptual bounds to generate new ways of thinking and creating. So now I'd like to very much thank you all. I'd like to thank my fellow Academy conveners for their incredibly imaginative and provocative panels, as well as our UTS Vice-Chancellor, Professor Andrew Parfitt, who generously spoke to us. I'd like to thank our interim Dean, Distinguished Professor Jim McNamara of this faculty, and welcome the incoming Dean of the Faculty of Design and Society, Professor James Bennett. It's wonderful to have you here. I do want to mention one person who really made this event happen was the former Associate Dean Research Professor, Ana Cristina Petiera, who basically got her checkbook out some time ago because I've been working on this for 2 years. And I'd also like to thank the current Associate Dean Research Professor Cilias. Big thanks also to my School of Design, Media, Communication, Education, Public History, Engineering, Design Thinking and Animal Logic colleagues, as well as all the others at UTS. Particularly a gentleman called Alex Munt, who has done so much to support and sustain my initiative over several years. I'd also like to make a particular mention of Linda Barwick, who's attending here, a former section head of the arts, who generated the idea quite early on that we workshopped quite a bit about how creative practice could be considered also as a form of compassionate action, which I thought was a beautiful concept, and really like to acknowledge Linda, and also Peter Tate, one of the former section heads of the arts, who's also done a lot to support me. I hope you have a really fantastic, rich and rewarding experience at UTS. Thank you. So I'm now close the introduction, and I'll invite the speakers for session 1 to come forward to, well, they are very much near the front, which is fantastic. And I have to do something called housekeeping, which I'm actually very good at doing myself. Very tough housekeeper. I'm going to try to guess what the housekeeping is. It's very important to observe emergency alarms. There are clear fire escapes marked in this building. There are bathrooms on the floor where you came in. If you have any questions or concerns or feel unwell, make sure you speak to our fabulous team outside the front door. We're in a lovely space now for 2 days because there's a fantastic cafe that even serves spritz and wine on the same level as us, and there's lovely outdoor areas if you need some time out, if you need to have a break and sit in the fresh air for 5 minutes. Don't be shy about doing that. Is that okay for the housekeeping? Yes. Yes, so I'm really, really thrilled that we have 2 people who agreed to open the symposium and in a way set the scene for the themes that we'll discuss. We had a record number of applicants for this event, which was very touching but also slightly overwhelming, and not everybody was able to be selected. But one theme that emerged in quite a few people's feedback was the theme of precarities and opportunities. And so that's what one of the themes that we'll commence with this morning, with a keynote by my UTS colleague, Dr. Felicity Wilcox, a keynote speaker, and there'll be a response from Professor Sarah Collins. And Dr. Felicity Wilcox is well known nationally as an award-winning Australian composer. Her work is broadcast and been performed in Australia and overseas. She's often commissioned She's worked with artists and ensembles. She's a composer. She's been assistant music director for many, many public events, including the Summer Paralympic Games in 2000 in Sydney. And she's composed soundtracks for over 60 screen productions as Felicity Fox, which is a great working name. She has many solo albums which have received critical acclaim. She's worked on chamber opera. One is called Threading the Light from 2022, which received 5 out of 5 from the Fine Music Sydney network. And she has a large collection of chamber works known as Uncovered Ground, which also has been acclaimed by the music critics at the Sydney Morning Herald. Her work is performed at festivals around Australia. There are too many to list, but it include Belvoir Street, the Canberra International Music Festival. And overseas, she's worked with the Philadelphia Orchestra. She's worked in Seoul, Paris, London, Manchester, Berlin, Helsinki, USA. So she's truly a global voice and a global practitioner. Here at UTS, she's senior lecturer in music and sound design. And very interestingly, she has a fascinating Australian Research Award, Early Career, a DECRA, as we know them, to conduct research into the matter of gender in opera and to compose a new contemporary chamber opera addressing inequity and also some of the more challenging themes that drive much of the operatic tradition. Felicity lives near me in the Blue Mountains on unceded Darug country, and where she actually conducts a fantastic musical salon that I've been delighted to attend. So she'll be talking to us about reclaiming opera for women and gender minorities through process and practice. And rather than disrupt the flow of the conversation, after Felicity's opening keynote address, there will be a response from Professor Sarah Collins. Sarah is Chair of Musicology at the University of Western Australia. Thank you for coming over to support us. And she's a very important figure in the Academy where she's the diversity lead. She's published very widely on the relationship between music, aesthetics and modernism in the late 19th and the early 20th centuries, and has worked as co-editor of Oxford University's press journal Music and Letters. She's won many awards, including the McCready Musicological Award from the Academy, which is considered to be one of the outstanding awards for contribution amongst Australian musicological scholars. Some of her books include Lateness and Modernism, Untimely Ideas about Music, Literature and Politics in Interwar Britain, and Music and Victorian Liberalism. And Sarah has worked at Harvard, Oxford, Durham, and is a very important contributor to our fellowship. So let's welcome our keynote and respondent. And should I sit there or over there? What do you think? Over to you.
Thank you, Peter, for that welcome, and hello, everyone. I'm honoured to open this exciting conference as keynote speaker for this session, aptly named Precarities and Opportunities. I think the placement of these two words is significant, as precarity is so often framed as bad or undesirable. Certainly, precarity is stressful and difficult to navigate, as most artists, and increasingly those engaged in humanities spaces within universities can attest. Yet precarity can also provide an opportunity that leads to resistance, resilience, and reinvention. I know this firsthand. Since my early 20s, I've inhabited both the freelance sector as an artist and the university humanities sector as firstly a student and now as an academic. As a composer, I've had many commissions in different areas of music over a long career. As a researcher, I have enjoyed the generous support of this university, UTS, and also of the Australian Research Council, who have enabled this research that I will present today. I'm mindful of my relative success and privilege within spaces that are so often closed to many. Yet nonetheless, I often have the impression that I'm operating at the margins of the music industry and the university system as well. Austrian musicologist Suzanne Kogler confirms this sense of precarity experienced by many women artists, saying, quote, "Artists, and in particular female artists, often create their works beyond the framework of institutionalized forms and genres," unquote. We should add genderqueer artists to this sentence, for whom marginalization and precarity can define their daily experience, not only their artistic one. In 2023, I published a report titled Women and Minority Genders in Music, which presented data from over 200 female and gender diverse music creators in Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand. Co-authored with Dr. Barry Shannon, who is gender diverse, it revealed that feeling marginalised and alienated in the music industry are common experiences for women and gender diverse folk. Further, that sexist tropes, attitudes, and a boys' club culture dominate mainstream spaces. Nearly 1/3 of respondents did not see role models in their field. Of those who did, only 3% could identify role models who looked like them, meaning they held key aspects of identity, such as race, age, and specific gender identity, in common. In turn, a lack of role models appears to have a dampening effect in confidence, productivity, capacities to step up for opportunities, and to imagine pathways forward. This is reflected in the participation rates of women in the field of music creation, which are globally disproportionately low. The Living Music Report found that just 4% of works programmed in Australia by our major performing arts organisations in 2020 were written by female composers. And research conducted by UK organisation Donne in Music reveals that of the repertoire performed by 111 of the world's leading orchestras in the 2023-24 season, just 7.5% was composed by women. This is to say nothing of gender deficits in music production, screen composition, songwriting, and other fields of music creation, in which women are consistently represented as tokens or under 15%. While prominent artists such as G Flip and Romy Vega are now breaking the binary in Australia, statistical data on trans and gender diverse music creator representation remain almost entirely lacking in such audits. Operas by women and gender diverse composers are rarely commissioned and programmed, especially at main stage level. Anger about this boiled over at the New Opera Workshop in 2019 in Brisbane, which revealed what Australian composer Lisa Lim called, quote, "the extent of the systemic forces that hold back women's participation in opera as composers," unquote. Australian state-level opera companies have programmed only a handful of operas by female composers or librettists. At the national level, from 2019 to 2022, just one of 48 operas programmed by Opera Australia was composed by a woman. That was Elena Katz-Chernon's Whiteley. This rate has risen slightly in the last 2 years, with 2 works by women composers staged in 2024 and 25, Missy Mazzoli's opera Breaking the Waves and Anais Mitchell's musical Hadestown. Both women are American. So I want to shape this talk today around 3 questions put by British soprano curator and essayist Juliet Fraser. What have we inherited? What are we building? And what do we want our legacy to be? I will apply these questions to opera and the broader music industry. I'm sure you will find ways to apply them to your own fields. Let us first consider what we've inherited in opera. Traditional operatic narratives have portrayed women as victims of murder and/or sexual violence. As argued by Catherine Clement in her 1979 critique, Opera, or the Undoing of Women, opera's canonic works are dominated by patriarchal control of women's bodies, sexuality, and power. These narratives were created in times when women walked the world largely as either oppressed wives, fallen women, or symbolic sacrificial angels. So, given such limited casting options, it's hardly surprising that, from Mozart to Wagner, opera's female characters tend to act out either ridiculous or tragic scenarios that provide for the sensation and drama deserving of opera's scale, with little nuance in between. Scholar Carolyn Abate counters that even though problematic narratives of gendered violence proliferate in 19th century opera, at the same time, opera has been a powerful vehicle for the evolution of female expression through its contribution to an unconquerable female identity. Quote, undone by plot, but triumphant in voice, unquote. She argues that the voices or identities represented in opera also encompass the physical voices heard within them. Thus, through its platforming of the voice's sonorous texture, opera has afforded status to its female interpreters in ways that historically other art forms have not. However, given that opera's plots and characterizations tend to be, in Abate's own words, quote, crushing for women, unquote, critical questions around core creative agency in opera still lead us to ask who gets to make operatic work and whose perspectives does this work favour? And in the mainstream at least, my own inquiries have led me to conclude that opera has always been made and remains overwhelmingly made by cisgender white men. US author, journalist and producer Danielle Smith calls the Metropolitan Opera in New York, quote, the capital of the global opera community, unquote. Established in 1883, the Met premiered its first opera by a woman, miraculously after only 20 years in 1903, and it was Ethel Smythe's Der Wald. Then waited a further 113 years before programming its second work by a female composer in 2016. That was Kaya Sariaho's L'amour de loin. It was 2021 before the first opera by an African-American composer was performed there. That was Terence Blanchard's Fire Shut Up in My Bones. And we still await the first performance of an opera by a woman of colour at the Met. Just consider how many hundreds of operas by white men fill those yawning gaps. In the post-Me Too era, we are now seeing in the opera world many directorial reinterpretations of popular existing works. Despite their good intention, these attempts to put to rights narratives that are not aging well more often than not function as a band-aid rather than a cure. And while male gatekeepers and male-led creative teams continue to hold sway within opera companies, as is overwhelmingly the case here in Australia and also in Europe, such initiatives can feel token and paternalistic. For example, in 2024, Opéra de Lyon's Rebattre les Cartes Festival proposed to reshuffle the cards by presenting 3 operas featuring strong female lead characters. Yet every production was led by an all-male composer-librettist team. Similarly, La Monnaie de Munt in Brussels commissioned 2 new works featuring lead female characters, Cassandra and Bovary, promising, but again, both were created by all-male composer-librettist teams. Allowing new stories to emerge told by women and genderqueer folk with their own perspectives on such narratives now feels urgent, at least to me. This is what we've inherited, and it might help to explain why representation for female and gender-diverse composers in opera remains so low, and why they are so poorly portrayed in operatic narratives. In turn, while women and gender-diverse folk are largely blocked out of the key roles of artistic director, composer, and librettist, the problematic narratives that have largely gone unquestioned to date will continue to form the basis of the repertoire that audiences get to know, with little new work offered to offset such out-of-touch and out-of-date perspectives. Chinese-American composer Du Yun told me in an interview that while viewing her first traditional Western opera as a young adult, she was aghast that the female lead had to sing an aria at the very moment she was being violated. This disconnect between the material and its artistic treatment stayed with her, and she vowed at that point that she would never, quote, do an aria just for the sake of it, unquote. In discussing her work Angel's Bone, an opera about human trafficking, she referenced this memory, saying, quote, when people ask why is there a punk voice in Angel's Bone and why was it done that way when the girl angel was being violated, because I remember that moment and no woman in that situation or no survivor in that situation would deliver an aria, unquote. Du's story underlines the importance of giving agency to women and minorities who may have their own perspectives on these matters, informed by their own marginalised identities and lived experience. Angel's Bone premiered at Beth Morrison's Prototype Festival, a forum that supports the creation of new operatic works by diverse creators. Du and Canadian librettist Royce Vavrek won the Pulitzer Prize in 2017 for Angel's Bone, an honour on which Du commented, quote, "We cannot pretend it doesn't matter, especially if you are a woman and not white. Absolutely, it matters," unquote. So, what does it mean to be part of a music industry that has, for centuries, ignored your perspective, undermined your talent and confidence, objectified your body, and systematically erased composers like you from the canon? How can we turn such precarity into opportunity? I'm currently completing an ARC Discovery Early Career Researcher Award to conduct research into and to create contemporary opera. I've spent half of the last 2 years based in Europe to hear new music theatre works, to interview practitioners, and to compose my own work, on which more soon. You can hear all the interviews I cite today on Emerging Voices, a podcast on the subject of contemporary opera. The operas I discussed today are just a handful of the more than 50 works I've been able to attend since January 2023. And the podcast is evolving. There will be more episodes released over the next months. In my research, I've tried to focus on works created by women, gender diverse and minority composers and librettists. These works tend to be found in the small to medium sector rather than on main stages of the large state companies, at festivals such as Prototype in New York City, Darmstadt in Germany, O in Rotterdam, Opera Forward Festival in Amsterdam, and Münchner Biennale in Munich. The risk-taking, innovation and inclusion that occur at the grassroots level and the diversity of representation in such spaces are important, nurturing and recalibrating factors in the opera space. As evidence of Australian opera director and scholar Sally Blackwood's claim that, quote, "innovation, risk-taking and reinvention of the operatic art form are to be found in the small to medium environment," unquote, US composer Ellen Reid's career ascendancy started in the experimental space with her opera Prism, also commissioned and produced by Prototype Festival. Reid went on to win the Pulitzer Prize for Prism in 2019, recognition that no doubt paved the way for her second opera, The Shell Trial, commissioned by Dutch National Opera and premiered in their Amsterdam Opera House in March 2024. Directed by Dutch-Indonesian siblings Romy and Gabel Rolofsson, this work tells a story of colonization and exploitation by the Dutch petroleum company Shell in Indonesia through the lens of both the colonized peoples and the invaders, with these groups also involved in the creation of the work. Another opera, Quartier Est, Bar d'Immeuble 4, is a work with original music by non-binary composer Eloane Lovis-Hübner. Commissioned by Opéra National de Paris, a staged workshop performance was performed in the Amphitheatre Olivier Messiaen at Bastille in 2024. Director Raphael Jacobs invoked composers who, quote, "both during their lifetime and in the posterity of their works are subject to the logics of domination that shape our society," unquote. The score blended original music by Hübner with existing music by composers such as Lili Boulanger and Hildegard von Bingen, among others. Revered Finnish composer and elder of European composition Kaija Saariaho's last opera, Innocence, is another rare example of a work composed by a woman, commissioned and performed at main stage level. Innocence takes place at 2 different times, during a wedding celebration in the present and 10 years earlier during a school shooting. We come to realize that the groom at the wedding is the brother of the shooter, and that the caterer at the wedding is the mother of one of the students who died, Marketta, whose melodies are sourced from Finnish shepherd calls, sung in Finnish in a folk singing style. The role of the ghost girl, Marketta, was created for and in collaboration with Wilma Jaa, a Finno-Ugric folk singer and researcher specializing in shepherd songs. This astonishing opera centers 3 women, the bride, the caterer, and the ghost girl, in a complex entanglement, revolving through time, language, and memory. So to Fraser's second question, what are we building? Perhaps these works point to an answer. Led by diverse teams, they use the theatre as a space for activism and reflection, and provide inspiration and role modelling to creators who are not men, and to the younger, more diverse audiences opera companies are increasingly chasing. And I would argue that if, as an arts community, we are to meaningfully respond to concerns raised about the sustainability of opera in the Australian National Opera Review final report, our national organisations must ensure a broader diversity of creators and the new repertoire they generate are offered a seat at the table. Aside from questions of equity, inclusion is also about sustainability, especially in countries like Australia, that are increasingly embracing their own cultural identities and autonomy outside a Eurocentric framework. And here in Australia, Christopher Sainsbury and Deborah Cheetham-Frelin are just two First Nations composers making operas that reflect their Aboriginal point of view and present aesthetic choices that reshape form and content in opera, contributing to its renewal. I'd love to have time to detail the interview I undertook with Chris Sainsbury about his opera, The Visitors, but you can listen to that on the podcast. Blackwood suggests that operatic practice that establishes more egalitarian relationships between creators, performers, and audiences through disruption of traditional approaches, quote, has the potential to change the power relations within and beyond the creative space, reclaim artistic agency, and give voice to all those in the room, unquote. I am seeking to enact this approach in my current project, Emergency, an original work of music theatre and the key output of my DECRA. In considering Fraser's third question, what do we want our legacy to be? I will not try to speak for others, but I will answer by speaking to my own work, which aims to offer a pathway forward to those who are alienated and marginalised, not only in its message, but in the very fabric of its doing. But first, a short taster. I now want to talk through some of the key concerns and methodological innovations underlying this work in progress. It's in the final phase of development, and a hand-picked team has ensured a range of perspectives and practices have been included in shaping the work. The concept which underpinned my successful DECRA application is that this is a creative work that translates my scholarly research by focusing on gender in music as its central theme, and drawing on the data and testimonials published in the Women and Minority Genders in Music report. Alana Valentine's libretto reclaims the narrative of sexual assault and presents it through an authentic lens. The story follows Renata, a mid-career composer and pianist who is facing significant roadblocks and nursing a dark secret, until through a transformative crisis, she confronts the truth. I'll just play a very short excerpt of the score at that climactic moment.
I denied it, I excused it, I dismissed it, I buried it, repressed it, suppressed it, I rejected my truth. I denied it, I excused it.
Okay, in the lead role, you heard singing there mezzo-soprano Jessica Azodi, whom Blackwood described as a performer who has, quote, deliberately chosen a path away from the standard repertoire opera, unquote. Other soloists include non-binary soprano Quinn Thompson, mezzo-soprano Nicole Smead, a multidisciplinary artist of Worimi and Biribai descent, Sonia Hollowell, a vocalist, writer, composer and educator of Dharawal and Inuit descent, and emerging soprano Jaden Selvakumaraswamy, a young woman of Sri Lankan heritage. The chorus is made up of young female and gender diverse performers from Danielle O'Keefe's The House the Dam Built Ensemble, including several living with disability. And this casting was targeted towards creating an ensemble of diverse identities who were also skilled in the musical methods I wanted to explore through this work. We began initial development for workshops in November 2023. Prior to these, I had compiled extracts from the anonymised testimonials from the report I co-authored, and during workshops I asked singers to select texts freely for interpretation through improvisation. I drew on improvisation techniques from experimental singer Lauren Newton, adapting them for the context. And in this way, we began our process by listening, me to the singers' voices and their responses to the testimonials, them to me, and also to each other. I'll play briefly a compilation of extracts from these improvisations during the workshops in 2023. I'd really like to start this one from halfway through, if at all possible. Technical people. I don't know if I can do that. Anyway, I'll play a very, very short excerpt of these techniques. Anyway, it gives you an idea of our process during those workshops. And I've since adapted and incorporated some of those improvisation techniques within my score. Here is an example. So this passage I've called a cadenza, and a cadenza is traditionally a passage improvised by a soloist within a structured work. I'll just play the clip quietly while I'm talking. You'll see I've notated broadly just the parameters around which the improvisation should be structured, such as pitch ranges for each voice, dynamics, and a mode or scale. I also provide written instructions as to the use of breath, the quality and duration of the sound, and whether or not singers should respond to the other voices and instruments that they hear. Thus, the performers have relatively free musical exchange in these passages of the score, which punctuate my more traditional fully notated sections at regular intervals. This intervention has the dual benefit of disrupting traditional opera aesthetics and also allowing performers who bring different qualities and performance backgrounds greater agency in presenting the material in their own ways. So the box text is Alana Valentine's set text, and around that, performers can improvise.
sympathetic conditions.
Cut that short there. In Emergency, Renata's suppressed memory of her sexual assault is an undercurrent rippling through the work. Research on gendered violence in the music industry reflects this and paints a damning picture. Our study found that close to 1 in 2, or 47% of respondents, had experienced sexual assault or harassment in their music workplace, a figure matched to the percentile in the UK by ISM's Dignity at Work 2022 report. These figures speak to an industry characterised by systemic sexism that impacts women and gender diverse composers' careers to an unacceptable degree. Emergency's libretto reclaims the many narratives of sexual assault presented throughout the history of opera and presents our version authentically through the lens of the research and our shared lived experience. Much effort was put into tackling this task in a responsible way. Earlier this year, it became apparent to me that the company might need support when working with this narrative through forthcoming rehearsals. So I engaged a somatic therapist to be accessible throughout the rehearsal period. In addition to group warm-up exercises before we began each day, she conducted exercises to neutralise stress as we left the work behind each afternoon. She also offered private therapy sessions in a dedicated space adjacent to the rehearsal room, which participants were invited to access at any time as needed, which almost everybody did. Understanding how embodying narratives of sexual assault and violence can trigger very difficult emotions for performers, particularly if they have direct experience of such, and allocating appropriate space and resources to support them during the process is important for those of us making work, I would suggest, in any art form. Also, sometimes we're required to pivot midstream to include those traditionally marginalised by our art forms. For example, in the original proposal, which attracted ARC funding, I planned to use brain-computer interfaces, or BCIs, to generate data that would then be transformed into electronic sounds to listen to the internal body due to the fact that its external features sometimes lead others to make problematic assumptions about gender. By the end of 2023, I was already considering timbres to map to emotional states. I had research assistants coding, and we had purchased the gear. During the workshops in November 2023, soloist Sonia Hollowell stated clearly that she would be uncomfortable continuing with the work if this method was pursued. For Hollowell, it triggered historic associations with invasive monitoring and surveillance of her peoples. From my perspective, as a member of the Settler Society in Australia, these concerns had never occurred to me. After carefully weighing up the conflicting loyalties to my soloist, to the research assistants, and to the ARC, I chose to take all BCIs off the table. This flexibility and respect was acknowledged by the other First Nations performer, Nicole Smead, who said, quote, "Our contributions have helped to shape the broader sonic landscape of the opera, ensuring that my cultural perspective and creative approach are embedded in the work's DNA," unquote. Another process currently unfolding is soloist Quinn Thompson's medical transition. Quinn self-describes as gender non-binary. Assigned female at birth, at the end of 2024, Quinn explained to me their, quote, "profound dysphoria at pretending to be or being received as a woman," unquote. Quinn began testosterone treatment in April of this year. Having cast all my soloists prior to beginning composition, I tend to compose with their individual voices in mind. And prior to starting the score, I'd noted their range, timbre, and other vocal traits. So currently, all parts composed for Quinn suit their original pre-transitioning soprano voice. The texture, timbre, and range of Quinn's voice are now evolving in unpredictable ways due to the testosterone. I reached out to Quinn recently for an update and received the following reply. Quote, "Vocal change has started to happen. What remains hard to predict is whether hanging in for noticeable change in speaking register, which I want to do, will mean that my voice breaks. If my voice does break, I will end up tenor or a baritone. Very hard to say which. I wish I could give you more definitive news," unquote. Methods we've discussed to ensure that Quinn can stay in the project include creating a new role for a tenor or baritone voice, or if their voice does not break but only lowers by a smaller range, swapping existing parts for their soprano voice with parts written for a mezzo range. They've also suggested making recordings of the work in progress as their voice changes, which will undoubtedly be helpful. I'm committed to continuing to include Quinn as a soloist in this work at one of the most challenging times of their life, while there is still flexibility and the process is within my control. Quinn reflected positively on this in a letter to me recently. The entire production has been set up to address the very inequities that are unpacked in the opera. Additionally, the method of developing the work has incorporated a degree of flexibility, inclusiveness, consultation, and trauma-informed approaches that I've never seen before. This kind of walking the talk is rare and very much needed. So in terms of enacting the notion of reclaiming opera, both through process and practice, I will admit that it is not easy. After all, we have centuries of harm to undo. During development, I have found the dual act of giving space and taking responsibility at the same time to be the most natural urge. Yet, walking this tightrope is also the greatest challenge. It becomes the work. It requires vigilance and self-regulation. It's about creating a culture of trust and openness, paying attention to people, and also paying attention to the work. It feels profoundly feminist to me in that it is about care, listening, and availability, all the things I practiced in my traditionally feminine roles as a mother and a teacher. Yet it is also about nuanced, engaged, high-level arts practice. This work requires a different model of leadership, innovating the time-worn tropes and methods of practice that characterize traditional opera requires developing authentic professional relationships and applying flexibility to those relationships and also to the work. This is important for any evolving art form, and in my case, it is indeed crucial in presenting a work that seeks to interrogate issues around systemic harm and exclusion. I've done this through the two-year development period so far for Emergency. In summary, through these methods, using improvisation as co-creation method, allowing for group decision-making, understanding how embodying narratives of sexual assault and violence can trigger performing artists, listening to all perspectives, including First Nations truth-telling, and pivoting to include artists during challenging times. In closing, I want to share a recent experience that I hope we can all draw strength from in the current hostile climate for humanities and the arts. This research was the subject of a masterclass I gave to musicology students at Evry University in Paris last month. After my talk, Alexandre, a young trans man, came up to me and thanked me effusively. He told me it was work of resistance. He told me it was important. He urged me to find a way to keep doing it. I was taken aback and rather moved. Not just because such acknowledgement is quite rare, but chiefly because during our conversation, I saw before me someone whose life is not straightforward and for whom my work is making a difference, someone for whom my endeavour matters at both a professional and personal level. The various interactions I've had with my team over the last 2 years making Emergency would affirm this too. And it's my hope, when we eventually receive production funding, that this creative work will speak to its audiences in similar ways. So today, I want to acknowledge the work of everyone in this room and everyone watching online, whether you're a historian, an artistic researcher, a sociologist, an educator, or you're disseminating First Nations knowledges. This is work of resistance. It matters. It changes lives, even when we're not aware that it's happening. And the urgent question in the current climate is, how do we continue to do this work beyond the institutional support that we've enjoyed, which we can no longer take for granted? It's a question for us all, including those who would take that support away. I believe it's time, now more than ever, to turn our precarity into opportunity together, to put forth work that, both through its content and in its doing, as political scientist Susan Bickford states, quote, might create a public realm where a plurality of voices, faces and languages can be heard and seen and spoken, unquote. We must try to do this as much through the work's process as through its content, and in this way we might disrupt the existing hierarchies of language and voice and create new opportunities. Thank you.
So my little response is called Thinking About Precarity Through Opera. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're gathering today. And given that we're talking about an art form involving multiple media, I acknowledge too that the First Nations people have long been involved in storytelling involving both voice and gesture and music for many millennia on this site before us. And continue to practice and refresh these traditions as part of one of the oldest ongoing cultures on the planet. I'd like to thank Peter McNeil for the invitation to be a responder, and also Felicity Wilcox for her generous knowledge sharing prior to the event. So in my short response today, I wanted to draw out the theme of precarity and change in relation to creative practice and gender broadly, as well as in relation to opera specifically. I'd like to suggest that opera as a genre, or a medium, or a form, is in fact uniquely positioned to play host to just the type of conversations that Felicity and others have described with respect to ingrained inequalities and precarity. And this might seem counterintuitive, especially given that, as we've just heard, opera history is littered with narratives in which women are raped, killed, driven to suicide, or presented as being hysterical, subversive, or dangerous, and in need of being controlled or ordered or dominated. In other words, there are narrative realities that ingrain gender inequality in and through opera. There are also social realities that might make our focus on opera look a little bit like special pleading. Surely opera's gender problem is merely a subset of a larger social problem. After all, we know that women and gender minorities face huge challenges across a range of workplaces, including disproportionate incidences of sexual assault and gender-based violence. Surely opera is simply just another mode of production, another form of labour like any other, just another workplace that has barriers for women and diverse peoples. What can opera, a genre known for its gendered violence on stage and its high-pressure workplace politics off stage, possibly tell us about how to turn the dial on this important issue today? Or put another way, what might it mean to think about precarity operatically, as it were? The point I would like to make is not only about the nature of opera, but also about the nature of social transformation and change and how it comes about. To adapt a point that Jacques Rancière made of the reasons for Emma Bovary's death in Flaubert's famous novel, we might say that when we jump from observing social realities to observing narrative realities, there's a middle bit that we also need to take account of, namely the process of representation itself. And by process of representation, I mean the way humans respond symbolically to the world around them by imitating it and by transforming it. And I'll come back to this idea of the dynamic between imitation and transformation later. But for now, we turn to the question of how opera might offer special mechanisms for thinking about precarity and gender. So I'd like to make two brief points in this respect. The first is about what the operatic voice can do, and the second point is about opera's own precarity and porousness as a metonym for social change. So the first point is on its face quite obvious. There's a curious relationship between the operatic voice and the body that produces it on stage, as we saw a bit of in these clips, especially in relation to Jess's voice, the main soloist. In opera, the voice seems to far exceed the body that produces it. You might think of opera as comprising mainly words and music, requiring a librettist and a composer, but in fact, commentators have long viewed the voice itself, that is, the materiality of the voice itself, as a semi-independent feature all its own. This creates what Caroline Abate has called the hand-in-puppet effect of opera, namely the sense in which some kind of external source is at work in bringing forth the voice, raising the prospect of compromised agency. Abate reads this as a spectre of mechanisation, the mechanisation or habituation that tugs at all of us as we struggle to imagine ourselves into being coherent subjects with our own free will and self-determination. We're all slaves to habit. We pretend like we're not. This effect of compromised agency is a generic feature of opera as an art form, as I mentioned. But importantly, it is also often thematized in opera. Opera is filled with characters who are under the sway of either real or supernatural forces, authorities, desires, compulsions against which they struggle in vain. Think of Berg's Wozzeck, Puccini's Turandot, Busoni's Faust, Bizet's Carmen, and even Mozart's Don Giovanni. The fact that characters and themes of compromised agency are so powerfully present within an art form that itself has this very feature hardwired into its generic fabric because of the voice-body split means that opera is often self-referential. It is often really at its heart about the process of representation itself or creation. As Teresa Havelkova has noted, quote, the attention to the gap or split between the body and the voice in opera harbors its own political claim. It relates to the larger critique of the Western representational regime, a critique that has been articulated most forcefully from the position of gender theory, end quote. So the point here is that the odd split between voices and bodies in opera resists the usual inclination to find unities between what you see and what you hear, something that speaks to both processes of representation and changing ideas about gender. There are other distancing mechanisms that are latent in opera too, of course. For example, we know that the characters on stage are singing, while at the same time understanding that within the narrative of the opera they're actually only speaking or thinking out loud. The act of having to suspend credulity to this end creates a crack that makes visible the mechanism for representation. This is sometimes experienced as opera's artificiality or excessiveness. This is the reason why some people don't like opera, I think. But this crack also creates opportunities for play and disruption. Another device, the offstage chorus, obscures the link between sound and vision in a way that feels, even today, at once alluring and unsettling, similar to the way that early sound recording technology was reportedly experienced. The sense in which, as Ulrich Gumbrich described, the phenomenon of hearing for the first time a recorded voice emerging out of the horn of a gramophone evokes both the fear of ghosts and the hope for eternal life. This combination of fear and hope, of allure and unsettledness that arises from opera's spectre of mechanization or compromised agency is also a feature of social change, which is the second and final point I wanted to make. We may well ask, how change is even possible when equality and prejudice is so riven into a system of knowledge and practice that it becomes difficult to see how any action, even an action of protest or revolution or disruption, can result in real change without becoming complicit in the same logic of the system that produced it. This is a problem to which some recent thinking on the topic of habit can apply, including the work of Catherine Malibu, Carolyn Pedwell, and Tony Bennett, the last of whom incidentally wrote a 5-Minute Friday piece on habit for the Academy some time ago. This work shows us that habit itself has a quality of automation and plasticity. It can be, on the one hand, unthinking repetition, or alternatively, it can be a way of fashioning oneself anew in a deeply ingrained and embodied ways, as in when new habits emerge over time. So in this way, habit has a double nature of both repetition and change, telling us something about how social transformation can occur, as well as about the process of representation itself, which you'll recall we spoke about earlier as involving both imitating and transforming the world around us, imitation being a form of repetition, transformation being a form of change. The way in which opera's generic features allows for self-reflection on this process, the voice-body split and other features creating a crack that makes the mechanism of representation visible, this is what defines its aesthetic quality. In essence, it means that opera can be performative in the sense of bringing about that which it describes. In asking what it means to think operatically about gender inequality and precarity, then what I'm trying to highlight is that middle bit between social realities and narrative realities, because it is in that middle bit the process of making things visible or invisible, audible or inaudible, where the true politics of the artwork lies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Felicity and Sarah, for this amazing opening to our 2-day symposium. Felicity really raised the matter of how important process is and ideation to creative practice, which will resonate with many people in the room. I was very struck by Sarah's response about the voice-body split, because I'd forgotten about how useful in my own work on subjectivity in the male body and dress, work like Wayne Kostenbaum's book, The Queen's Throat or The Queen's Voice, is so fascinating about, well, that's sort of, he writes very accessible but erudite books and asks the basic question, why do gay men like going to the opera? Part of it is artifice, but it's much more than that. So I absolutely love this opening section. Now, I'll just explain. We want to give you all a feedback loop, a chance to respond. So we have two modes for you to engage with our fabulous panel. There will be a roving mic in the room, looked after by Dr. Tets Kumara. So if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand and we'll try and get the mic to come to you. And we're also having online questions, and the staff will monitor questions via the live stream, which we will then voice in the room. And we have about nearly 10 minutes for some questions now for the panel. Yes, just behind you there, Michael.
Thank you very much. This is to Felicity. Thank you for a sensational presentation. As someone who's thought quite a lot about some of the issues that you have raised and which you're pursuing in your practice, I just want to raise one technical point. Opera has been transformed by the use of surtitles in two ways. The first was that we suddenly realized just how banal some of the words were to some of the most famous arias in history. I love you too. But the other addresses a much more interesting thing, which you didn't really touch on, which is implicit in your work. And that is the question of the dialogue between musicality and verbal audibility. In the extract, the last extract you played with the improvisations during a declamation of Alana's text, almost none of Alana's text was audible to me, and I'm not deaf. Are you going to rely on surtitles to add that extra dimension of intelligibility of the text, or do you consider this not to be a real problem? Thank you.
Thank you for that observation and question. I probably wasn't helped that I was talking over it for audibility. And it's interesting to me because I know the text when I listen back to that without me doing a lecture over it. It's quite understandable, but it's possible that it's not if you don't know the text. So that is an interesting observation, which I take on board. Yes, I suspect we'll be relying on surtitles. I don't think I've seen an opera in the last 3 years in these research excursions that doesn't have surtitles. It's also particularly important when you're traveling and you don't know what language the opera is going to be in, or indeed what the surtitles are going to be in. And I had an experience actually at O in Rotterdam where most of the work commissioned is Dutch, and most of the librettists write in their own language, which is fair. It's a Dutch festival. They're commissioning original work from Dutch librettists and composers. But I felt really locked out because they didn't have surtitles for most of the works. And so I couldn't, not speaking Dutch, I couldn't understand. And it made me, that relationship between the verbal understanding and the way music carries that verbal content was really apparent to me when I couldn't understand the words. So yes, I would always lean towards understandability of the libretto, absolutely.
I just wanted to draw in another factor too, in the sense that there are historical precedents for certain operatic forms in melodrama and pantomime as well, forms that relied very much on bodily language and also placards, which were of course reappeared in the context of silent film in the early 20th century, where you had the intertitles. And I know that there's a range of writing of when synchronized sound film came in towards the end of the 1920s, that people found it a loss that there was synchronized voice with the images, that you could understand that it was intelligible immediately. They found that the realism of that was somehow less artistic, had a less aesthetic quality, and there was something lost in that, in the intelligibility of the voice and the synchrony of the voice and body, which is interesting. So I think there's things that can be gained from considering those alternative forms of communication as well.
I was thinking a lot about the genre itself, which I think, Sarah, your reflections really teased out somewhat. But Felicity, I was interested in hearing what you think about, given the inheritance of the genre, the form that you're now finding ways to reshape through your work. I noticed that several of your composers talked about bringing in punk singing in order to really rethink the role of one of the principal singers, and there was also discussion of folk modes of singing, and I noticed that you referred to your work as musical theatre and music theatre. Thanks. And so I was just wondering about this question of genre, to what extent you want to throw out opera as a form, and to what extent it's still useful, and if so, what is it about opera that you want to hold on to? Is it about modes of singing, particular vocal production? Is it about the structure? Is it? I wonder if you could say more about that in your realization of this.
Yeah, thank you for that question. There's quite a lot in it. So just to speak firstly to the different aesthetics, really, which is what you're talking about when we're talking about a punk voice or a folk singer, or Chris Sainsbury spoke to me about he has an all First Nations cast for the visitors because it's telling a story from First Nations perspective, and that required opening up the parameters around aesthetics for certain types of voices. I'm quite intentionally doing the same thing in my work. I can't write for voices I don't like or connect with. It's sort of, as a composer, something that is important to me. And all the voices that have been involved in the development so far are voices that I really, really appreciate and enjoy writing for, but they're not all opera voices. Some of them have a slightly lighter quality. Obviously, Jessica's is an incredibly fine-honed operatic voice, and she has international experience and is incredibly skilled. But some of the others have a less operatic aesthetic to their voice, and I absolutely want to bring that in, and that's part of why I've opened up the parameters so that they can improvise and bring what they bring. Sonia Hollowell is an incredible improviser. She uses mouth sounds, breath sounds in ways that are completely her own, and so to harness that expertise, I'm really intentionally opening up the work to improvisation in certain sections. That said, when they're singing my stuff, my more notated stuff, they do tend to drop into their more operatic style of voice. But Du Yun, who I spoke to about this, and Chris Sainsbury also, who I spoke to about this, interestingly, both of them have sort of non-Western cultural heritage, are both absolutely convinced that in order to include other kinds of practitioners and other kinds of practice, you need to relax the parameters around what vocal type you're expecting to hear when you go to the opera. And I think we can do that in opera. I don't think it means it suddenly becomes a musical because you have a punk voice or a rock style voice or a folk style voice. I mean, Kaya Sariaho's Innocence, there's no way you could call it anything else than an opera, and yet there's these beautiful moments where the Finnish folk singing style comes in. So I don't personally feel there's a disconnect between those aesthetics and opera, and I think if anything, we should probably relax our expectations slightly around what aesthetics opera should have, because unless we do that, we're going to get stuck in this kind of past looking over our shoulder type of art form, and we want to take more people with us going forward. So I definitely see the work I'm making as opera or music theatre. Musical theatre are musicals, so it's a bit confusing. But in Germany, in the European scene, they tend to call opera music theatre because they're working very much with a theatrical kind of background, a theatrical concern. So it's like modern contemporary theatre, but just sung.
Thank you very much, Felicity, and thanks everyone, Sarah, Felicity, and the room for this fantastic dialogue.